Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Africa's Symposium. We're now moving into session 3, and I would like to start by introducing, my name is Maureen Salmon, for those of you who are joining this afternoon and were not there this morning. I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Dr. Mark Seeley, OBE. He's the Executive Director of Autograph and Professor for Photography, Rights and Representation at UAL, and is affiliated to the Photography Archive and Research Center at LCC, which is a college where I'm based, which is fantastic. Mark is interested in the relationship between art, photography, and social change. Identify politics, race, and human rights. He has written for many of the world's leading photographic journals, produced numerous artistic publications, curated exhibitions, and commissioned photographers and filmmakers worldwide. I'm going to pause there and suggest that you read Mark's profile in full. And his most recent last 2 publications are actually worthwhile reading. Welcome, Mark. Because of time, I'd like to welcome our speakers and would like to invite you to put your cameras on. And I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. Because of time, we're not going to read all the biogs. What I will do, I will start with the first 4 presentations, and then we will have the 10 minutes or so for Q&A. And then we'll take the next 4 presentations and then Q&A. I will take the first 4, and then Mark will take over from me. And we will take the presentation in the order they appear in the program, unless, of course, we have any technical problems, then we will move to the next speaker. So our first speaker. So if you put your cameras on and introduce yourselves, we know can meet all of the presenters. Are you all able to hear me? Because I can't see anything happening at this end.
Can hear you fine, Maureen, yes.
Yes.
Okay. So
yes, we can hear you.
Camera on?
Yeah.
Maureen, my camera won't go on and the host has disabled it.
Oh, I'm sorry for that, Sevia.
We'll stop that now, thank you.
Just as a little bit of a technical thing, we've got how many presentations? 10 presentations? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, haven't we?
8. 1 presentation. We have three speakers together.
Oh, okay.
So
cool. I was wondering how I was doing my maths.
And Ranji.
Okay.
So is it not technically possible to see all our presenters in?
George, could you stop the
frame?
screen share, please? Great, there you go.
That's great.
Yeah.
So what I was saying is that if you could each introduce yourself, and then we will start with Dr. Job's presentation.
Should I just start?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ranji. I'm a UCT graduate.
So no, Ranji.
Yes, my name is Ranji.
Yes, we're starting with Dr. Job.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was with you. Sorry.
Who is a postdoctoral research fellow at HUMA, University of Cape Town.
Not currently on this call, I don't think.
Okay, so we'll go to the next speaker, which is Professor Mazhood Badarin, Professor of Law at SOAS, University of London. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And that's my introduction. Yeah, I'm from the law school at SOAS. Do you want me to start with my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Well, perhaps maybe the right thing to do is to first thank UL for inviting me to participate in this conference. Thanks to Maureen and Lynn. We have been communicating on the emails. And my presentation is titled, Projecting an African-Specific Voice in Law and Development Discourse. I want to speak to it. I'm not going to use any PowerPoint or presentation. I'm speaking of my cuffs on this one. It's not a pure art topic, so to say. So one will say, I'm from the law department, and it's in relation to law and development discourse. But if we see art as part of development, in the sense of, maybe liberal arts and social sciences, then the topic is quite relevant, particularly in relation to the 5 key questions that this conference seeks to address. Now, the law and development scholarship, broadly understood, refers to the theory, dealing with the theory and practice of interrogating the role of law in development, particularly in relation to economic and social progress, particularly of developing countries. Now, it's relatively a new area, discipline, where it relates to this conference, particularly in relation to collaboration. It started in the 1950s, late 1950s, 60s. So in relation to academic scholarship, it is usually seen as being relatively young. It started in the United States of America, American academics, together collaborating with the development experts and development institutions such as, the Rockefeller Institute and others. It was aimed at, promoting legal and institutional reform in developing countries, particularly Africa, Latin America, modeled particularly on American models of economic development, particularly, and legal reform and legal institutions. Now, this relates to the fact that always there's a need to collaborate, particularly with different institutions, particularly in the global South. But not very long, just about 10 years, a lot of money was spent into that collaboration, a lot of money. And sometimes it is critiqued as academics just following the money. America wanted to put money in developing countries. So American scholars brought up this initiative of law and development. And later, you find that it was critiqued in various ways. And the critique related to the fact that, it was externally driven. The academics that were involved didn't understand the African landscape. They didn't understand how law works in Africa. They didn't. So it was such a system of legal transplantation, transplanting American norms, wanting to transplant it into developing countries. And also you find out that, some of the hindering factors was that, the initiative was a sort of a one-cap-fits-all initiative. They are addressing all developing countries, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. But particularly in relation to Africa, it was not Africa specific. And if you look at the literature today, one will be able to see that even up to today, most of the literature on law and development are written by Western scholars and Latin American scholars. There have not been a lot of African scholars contributing to that. And when we talk about development, whatever we talk about in relation to Africa today, the debate is around development. Therefore, and if you look at the theories of traditional law and development, I mean, there are Western theories based on, I mean, international relations theories of, I mean, the theory of modernization, for example, based on the writing of scholars like Rostow, or the stages of economic development, whereby he identified 5 stages that every country must go through if they really want to develop. That is, they have to spring from being a traditional society into the age of mass consumption if they really want to develop. And this is the theories that have been propagated, particularly in relation to Africa. The other theory is the self-dependency theory, that indicating that, well, by doing that, it makes developing countries to depend on the global north in order to be able to develop. Now, based on this, I mean, African scholars, we African scholars in SOAS, I mean, looking at this from the law school, developed an idea that it is important, I mean, for African scholars to contribute to that scholarship, to contribute to the discourse, to, I mean, identify, initiate an African-specific voice in the law and development, I mean, initiative. In that regard, I mean, I'm from Nigeria, we have a colleague from Zimbabwe, another from Tanzania, and another colleague has joined us on the project now from Ghana. Now, I mean, in doing that, you know, we first identified the need to create, and perhaps maybe when we talk about collaboration, it's important, for example, I mean, to be able to, I mean, look at the literature and create a voice within the particular, I mean, field itself. And this is what we try to do. We first start, I mean, we thought there was also a need for a link between research and also teaching. And in the law school, we initiated a novel course, I mean, law and development in Africa. I mean, we searched all law and development courses across the world. There wasn't any one specifically in Africa. So we started law and development in Africa course specifically. And interestingly, African students really bought into it. You know, I mean, and we identified that, well, they could really contribute to the debate. They brought in new knowledge in order to be able to contribute to the debate. Now, after we have stabilized this, I mean, a couple of articles published in that, we then outreached, you know, particularly to the University of Lagos, the Faculty of Law, these were personal initiatives in relation to staff. You know, we, people like Professor Wally Smith, you know, in the School of Law, and recently also with Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And the initiative is about the need for African scholars and African countries to push the initiative that there's a need of to think about the conscious use of law, you know, as an instrument of development. And because of time, we identify 4 main areas, and all these main areas relate to the 5 big questions that we are looking at. Now, we have started what we call the Law and Development in Africa Network, you know, whereby we believe that there's a need to bring African scholars in the diaspora and African universities who are interested in this area, although our research identified the fact that not many African universities are into that, teach that course specifically, but I mean, they are starting to get interested in this area. And what we are aiming at in this regard is that there's a need. I mean, this is a specialist area relating to development, the relation between law and development. And when we talk about Africa, I mean, is aiming at development. There's a need for an African voice in that regard. And the network is, I mean, improving. Then research collaborations, particularly in relation to the literature, you know, publications from African scholars in that field is very, very important in order to have a voice. You know, we have a manuscript which has been accepted in principle with the Oxford University Press now, looking at law and development in Africa, specifically theories and practices. If you look at the literature, there isn't any literature at all, you know, looking at law and development in Africa. You have law and development in Asia, South, nothing on law and development in Africa. So, I mean, the point I'm trying to indicate is perhaps maybe one way of really having inroads is perhaps maybe to survey literature and make sure that perhaps the African voice is heard. And this could be in other disciplines as well, apart from law and development. And then joint programs. I mean, we have been working on trying to do joint programs, teaching of similar to the one we have at SOAS, the Law and Development in Africa module, you know, co-teaching it with, and we are discussing this with the University of Lagos and also Stellenbosch in our last meeting that we had. But I mean, there are a whole lot of, issues in place in relation to, quality assurances and things like that. We have identified these, and perhaps, it's an area we need to work on. And then the fourth area is, joint research grant applications. We want to see it as a collaboration of equals. African scholars in the UK who have interest in this area, collaborating or initiating African scholars across, Africa, to also be able to, collaborate with us in that regard. It is still work in progress, but I just thought perhaps, it relates to all the 5 key questions that, for example, in relation to, the local context of collaborations. Law and development discourse is international, but then we want to localize it, want to bring it back, to localize this in the African context, and partnership for change and transform. For example, in relation to the theories, we have identified that rather than recasting the modernization theory, the theory of dependency theory, there's a need. Some of my writings indicated there's a need for Africans to push what we call a self-reliance theory. The African country scholars in relation to law and development need to push a self-reliance theory. Looking at the laws of Africa, looking at what type of development does Africa itself want for itself, in relation to, and then, putting literature on that in the public realm. And the second thing we have identified is the conscious use of law. There's a need for Africa, working with legislators, to actually legislate for development. There's a need today, many African countries just legislate, there's a need to have a developmental objective for legislation. And in doing that, art comes into the picture. We have been talking about the issue of, for example, economic mapping of cultural and creative industry for development. This will need legislation, and legislators need to understand, the role that law can play in development, even in relation to pure arts, in order to be able to get this on board. So it's a new area. We are working on it, and I thought it was it's a good example of different ways by which African scholars in the diaspora should be collaborating with our colleagues in the universities in the global south. So I hope this is meaningful to the discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for your presentation. That's very relevant, and I'm going to come back to that in terms of intellectual property when we have the discussions, because that's a key one for Africa.
That's right.
So we now have Dr. Job Mawa.
Oh, thank you, Maureen. Sorry, I didn't realize that I was muted. My name is Job Maura, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at HUMA at the University of Cape Town. And thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. So let me just go through my presentation, particularly because of time. And I begin by saying that Africa's modernity issue is centered on knowledge production, and this has remained a significant puzzle in unlocking post-independence growth. International development, economic development, and innovation on the continent faces a myriad of structural issues, particularly because of the effect of the 2008 global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, which has demonstrated how critical it is to invest in building and strengthening Africa's knowledge ecosystem in order to better prepare for a rapidly digitizing world without a traditional physical contact and conviviality for which the continent is known. Now, HUMA, which is my institute, in collaboration with LASPAD at Glastonbury University, and with funding from the Open Society Foundation, embarked on a continental research project aimed at producing new knowledge on scholarly publishing, independent publishers, scholarly platforms, and dissemination outfits, and their contribution to positioning African knowledge production as a critical component for sustainable development and change. Now, since the beginning of 2021, the research project has sought to generate new empirical based insights on scholarly publishing and dissemination in the African continent by generating data through various ways, such as doing interviews, seminars, podcasts, and reading seminars, and so on. We came into the project fully aware that there was a myriad of challenges we needed to map out. But what are these challenges that are faced by scholars and researchers on scholarly publishing in the continent? Well, there are a number of challenges that have been in existence in African post-colonial states, which have continued to impact knowledge production in the continent. Issues such as funding of research and development in universities in Africa remain a key challenge, which hinder access to globally produced knowledge, inability to attend conferences and other international forums, inefficient and lack of internet connections, poor mentorship of postgraduate students, issues to do with language barriers, etc. These are some of the examples of the common problems. Although this does not mean that there are much lesser problems. They have been facing them, most African institutions and scholars in their attempt to produce knowledge. But there are also emerging issues that we have also marked out in our research. Colonial issues of political domination, economic and political dependence, exploitation, and racial and cultural inequality continue to impact the knowledge production that we now see as academic colonialism. For instance, in this research, we have seen how the African modes of producing knowledge have been placed at the peripheral by scholars from the global north, some of whom are now domiciled in our African institutions. Often, when such professors encounter Black intellectuals working with Western traditions, they are forcefully reminded of the methods, the history, the language, and the traditions from which those areas of scholarship emerged. If you miss out on that, you can even be failed for a senior graduate qualification. So it is unfortunate that as Black thinkers, we must master the Western traditions for whose training we are subjected, while also having to piece together our own modes of thinking as Black folks. This obviously impacts on scholarly writing. Some other research findings that we found out was that African scholars and researchers have to adopt to certain ways of writing in order to fit acceptable style of writing. For instance, scholars from the global north see no need to locating their research. They might be working in Brighton or Dagenham, but this will not appear in the title. If it appears, there will be no reference to the fact that these are locations in the UK. Thus, scholars in the global north tend to write in a universal term, as if their findings were always of universal relevance, while scholars from the global south always write in local terms, as if not sure whether they can contribute to larger debates. This is still an inferiority mentality, thanks to colonialism. All knowledge has the potential to be extrapolated and generalized to entire populations, but also since every region has its own particularities, all knowledge is local, and what we produce should be as valuable. I put a screenshot of my Google Scholar there because I think I'm also one of the victims. If you see the titles of my papers, they all have my location in them, either Africa or where I come from in Kenya. Now, with increased conversation, let me first of all mention the issue of metrics, of measuring knowledge, which are also racially exclusionary. Indices such as citation indices are developed in the global north. scholars from the African continent remain undercited and less likely to serve in the editorial boards of scholarly publications. Critical race theorists have been interested in how the politics of citation have shaped the disciplinary knowledge and the career trajectories of scholars of color. For instance, 2 days ago, I saw the list of the top social science and humanities scientists published by research.com based on citation metrics. As far as I could tell, it was a list dominated by white men, most of those who are listed in 4 African nations are mostly white scholars domiciled in our African continent. Now, with increased conversation of decolonizing of scholarly publishing and knowledge production, scholars and researchers in the global South are finding more ways to speak out against these entrenched colonial ideas impacting scholarly publishing in the continent. For instance, when scholars from the global North show dominance and begin to own our own local ways, they are quickly spotted and called out. Digital media spaces are giving voices to scholars and researchers in unprecedented ways. Muibiwa also mentioned this. African researchers and scholars are now keen when global North scholars come to our African continent, conduct research for 2 weeks, and then call themselves experts in certain fields. 3 weeks ago, a Berlin-based journalist and author, Trish Lawrence, implied that she had come up with the phrase "sorosoke," a Yoruba term that means, speak up. Equally important, it was noted that our research, that there is a drive for African scholars to work outside the conventional structure of knowledge production and scholarly publishing, which is rooted in desire to combat an unequal representation in the global academic knowledge production. For instance, editorial policy of the African Journal of Social Work anticipates that authors will have most of their citation from the continent, including African books, articles, definitions, concepts, theories, frameworks, and oral literature that is abundant in Africa that has not been tapped in social work. Other journals like Lancet have indicated that it will continue to reject articles, submissions that with data from Africa that fail to acknowledge African collaborators in interest of building African research and promoting integrity. Let me not mention the issue of Arua because it has been talked about. But let me just conclude by saying that the scope of scholarly publishing project at HUMA and the project we are doing with HUMA and Glassford is a big, is big, and issues mentioned here are just a drop in the ocean of the myriad of issues the continent is grappling with to leverage in global knowledge production. But even with these issues, the continent is not just sitting and wallowing in the issues. I've shown a few examples of the solutions being adopted by African scholars and researchers. Research and debate on scholarly publishing and knowledge dissemination in Africa are important for sustainable development and needs to be continuously nurtured. Let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Job. We now move to the next speaker, Dr. John Fass, course leader, MA User Experience Design, UAL.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thanks so much to inviting me to talk at this event. I've learned a huge amount already, I must say. Our presentation is going to be a maybe slightly tighter frame. I'm going to talk about some collaborative projects that students did on a course that I was running 2018, which was a BA in Information and Interface Design. I'm now the course leader for an MA in User Experience Design. I'm just going to share my screen if you give me a second. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes, thanks, John.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. This is me. I'm very open if you want to send me anything, send me a message or anything like that. We worked with 2 organizations, both NGOs, active across Central Africa, specifically for this project in South Sudan and Cameroon. Just the frame so you can see who they are. They're called ROGUE, R-O-G. The URL is at the bottom of the screen there. They run a number of parallel projects. One of their largest ones is called Defy Hate Now, and that's about countering online incitements to violence in multiple countries across Central Africa. Another one of their projects is the Migrant Media Network, and they run another one called Ascotech, and a couple of others. Ascotech's about access to tools, computing tools, computational tools for people. The other organization we're working with is called the Peace Tech Lab. Again, that's a peace building NGO. They work across the world. They have been specifically very active in this space in building up lexicons of hate speech terms. And the South Sudan one was one of the first ones that they did. Online incitement to violence often has very extreme consequences in South Sudan. And it's actually very difficult to know who is saying what to whom, with what frequency, using what channels, what words and terms exactly are they using. There's also a number of language groups in South Sudan that further complicate the issue. That's by way of background. This is a piece of interactive visualization. This is scraping data from one very active Facebook channel and trying to work out which language groups are active in this online incitement to violence discourse. So what languages are people saying things in? And previously, this knowledge about the Arabic language groups in South Sudan, it just didn't exist. It wasn't captured or capturable. Before we wrote some ways of scraping Facebook to get this data. So you can see on the little menu, everyone, divide by language. And then you have a lot of groups that are, they exist, but no one's saying in them anything in them, what we might call an inactive group. And then what you see on the screen here, these are the active groups. And you can see them divided by Arabic and English. And so this shows in a visual way that English is the language used most. Obviously, Facebook also has private groups. And so the next menu item shows that these individual circles represent the number of followers that a particular channel would have. For example, what we're looking at here is inactive groups. Yes, there are some of them, but there's not many people in them. Active groups, there are a lot of them. They're dominated by English language and English speakers. Unknown, always really important in data viz to be able to show, well, we don't know. We know the languages, but we don't really know who's saying what. Moving on to the next project. This is quite a well-known image now. Back 2018, South Sudan. This purports to be a South Sudanese fighter jet. South Sudan does not have an air force and does not own any fighter jets. And so this project is about revealing that with a kind of interactive swipe over on this airplane. I think it's a Ugandan flag, so it's deliberately repurposed by some voices in this particular person, Gordon Boye, to try and incite the notion that South Sudan would be able to bomb its opponents in particular ethnic groups or language groups. And then we start to look at individuals and what they're saying and who they are. So this individual's got 5,000 Facebook friends. What tends to happen is that people change their names quite often. And so the same person might reappear under a completely different identity. And some of the things people this person might be saying, some of them are quite extreme. You can see some quotes down here for what people have been saying. The next project, we're trying to get a bit more detailed on individuals who are active in these groups. And obviously for us to know this, we are working very closely with local activists all over the country in South Sudan who were able to help us identify who individuals are. For example, someone might have 3 or 4 names, but it's the same person. And then we were then able algorithmically to identify keywords from the Peace Tech Lab lexicon that are identified as terms that are used in online incitement to violence. Reach and network depth is a major issue here as well. So it's often quite unclear. Someone might be saying something very loudly, but it's often unclear how many other people are seeing that. And Facebook only allows you to go so deep in their network graph. There is an estimation, the researchers have found that if there's one active follower in a Facebook channel, then there's something like 25 to 35 other people who might see that aren't necessarily active or aren't necessarily followers. That kind of work enabled us to produce this kind of graph, which then maps all the names that we were given by our local partners and then mapping them against specific channels and specific terms. So a bit of interactive data visualization. So those 4 projects went forward in a report. It eventually found its way to UNESCO. And the last project I'm going to show is in the context of the Cameroon elections of 2018. And the Cameroonian government were very concerned that the electoral process would be manipulated by social media actors, particularly in light of the conflict in the south of Cameroon and the language groups there. So we were asked by UNESCO to put together a pilot, a prototype, if you like. So we took 1 month, and these are particular accounts, Facebook accounts of people who are very active. Then we're able to identify the keywords that they're using in those accounts, and then filter according to those keywords. These are days. This is what a post would say, and this is that post filtered by keywords, again, from our local partners in Cameroon and building on the hate speech lexicon in Cameroon. I know that's very fast. Time is limited, but I guess the wider context or the wider question would be, what we were trying to address is how a room full of undergraduate or postgraduate designers sitting in an art and design school in London, and you may or may not know, but certainly at postgraduate level, we have very few UK students. It's very, very mixed internationally. At MAUX, we get quite a few applicants, certainly Nigeria, Kenya, and a few other countries. So it's quite a complex mix of backgrounds and ethnicities. And it's very much an open question, I think, as to how to manage this kind of project. Often our NGOs, collaborators are a window into a much larger group of people who would be requesting help of this particular kind. So on one level, the students are an engine of production. On another level, the course starts to be able to position itself as reaching not just beyond the university, but beyond the country and beyond the continent, and think about what internationally engaged creative digital practice might look like. That's the end of my presentation. I'm trying to keep it quite short. Of course, there's large amounts of questions that come out of that. I'd be really welcome some feedback or critique or comments maybe later on in the session.
Thank you, John. Moving on to the next speaker, Toshkin Animashwan, Chief Executive of LGK Foundation. and you're about to embark on a collaboration with the London College of Fashion.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Gosh, I feel completely overwhelmed by all these really intelligent people on here. I wonder if I should be here at all. Anyway, yes, my name is Tosinani Mashan, and my day job is that I work at UNESCO, Mr. Fass. I hope you're working with Forrest Whitaker with your Sudan project. Okay.
I don't know about that connection, but I would certainly like
well,
to.
I need to put you in touch with them because I think they'd be quite interested in what you've just been showing us. And my other job is to help my mother run the LGK Foundation. My mother set up the LGK Foundation in 2020 in the height of the first closed lockdown that we had, and wanted to use the foundation to support people in the creative industries, Africa-wide, she said. But I wanted us to start on a project in Nigeria, at least to give ourselves some credibility. So I started to run a sector analysis together with a friend who used to be in a consulting firm, on the textile and fabric sector. Why textile and fabrics? Because the Nigerian government is investing a huge amount of money into reviving the cotton sector in Nigeria, the cotton growing sector, to try and bring it up to what it was before the 1980s and structural adjustment programs. Through that process, we were looking at different things through technical workshops that we had to hold online because of the situation. And on the one on education and capacity building, we got in contact with UAL, and they put us in contact with the London College of Fashion. And we had an absolutely stimulating discussion on the possibilities and the requirements of capacity building. Now, one of the things that came up that struck me anyway in that discussion was the lack of scholarly produce from Africa, even from Nigeria. And so it pointed me in a direction of wanting to do something along those lines. Two things. Capacity building is very poor. And there's just, I mean, if you want to read anything academic about fabrics in Africa generally, it's usually written by a European or somebody from off the continent. And I was intrigued by this and realized that in talking to young people who are in fashion and in fabric design and stuff, that they're not really being shown the advantages of doing research on what's happening with fabrics or anything else in that area. So one of the things that the foundation is trying to do now is to raise funds in order to support research, but research that's done jointly, perhaps where necessary, with somebody in a university outside the continent, just to give guidance and so on. With UAL, we are discussing a project at the moment to set up an education platform. No, I don't want to call it an education platform, a capacity building platform. The aim of which will be to provide capacity building on 3 levels. On the first level, it'll be done with using podcasts, because a lot of young Africans, frankly, just don't have the means to pay for internet. So if we do anything other than podcasts, they won't be able to access it. Second level, there will be some video stuff. And then on third level, I'm working with several people, the Institut de la Mode in Paris, a fashion school in Italy, an association of retired artisans who work in fashion, and also the Michelangelo Foundation in Switzerland, to try and organize masterclasses. So the idea would be to start this as a pilot project in Nigeria first, working in partnership with the Federal Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment. And once we've got it right, to open the possibilities up to other African countries that might want to be involved. Another thing we're trying to do is some business to business, i.e. to provide opportunities for African artisans, artists, creators to access an international market. It's very, very difficult for them to do. Somebody was talking earlier, I think it was the gentleman from Cape Town University, about how difficult it is for African scholars to go to symposiums and such abroad. The same is true for African creatives, accessing the fairs and exhibitions that they need to be at in order to access an African, an international market is practically impossible. So I have just come out of doing a fair in Paris, which is a fair for interior designers and architects, collectors, galleries. And my mother decided to take 10 Nigerian artists to this fair. It was absolutely amazing. I mean, I've never done an exhibition or a fair in my life. So for me, it was already quite exciting to be there. But it was extraordinary to see just the interest in what was produced, and to see the enthusiasm of the artists, all of whom have made sales, got orders, and have been invited now to participate in other fairs. So we're only very small, but hopefully what we're doing will have an impact. I have some support from the Nigerian government. It grew when they saw what the potential is. I think that's the key. I think we need to show African governments what the potential is, so that they will do the necessary thing. I was very interested in Dr. Badirin's presentation because he was talking about the legal frameworks. And yes, there is a need for the legal side because most of these artists suffer from intellectual property right issues. So I'd be very interested in hearing what he's got to propose in that regard later. I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Toshkin, for that, and thank all our 4 presenters. I've pulled out 6 points and that I'm going to highlight and then open it up for questions. The first is what's really interesting is the interdisciplinary nature of these presentations. We have arts and culture, we have politics, we have economics, we have law, we have education, we also have digital technology. And all of these are framed into what I call the global context issues and trends, and how we use these to address the key priorities for Africa and focusing on economic development and growth. And I was also interested in hearing how we talk about how we continue to value traditional African theories and practices in a modern context regarding research and knowledge production. And then we also hear around, the role that digital technology places and design. So I will now like to open up for questions from the audience. Any questions? While we're waiting, the intellectual property is a very, very important one. And I've been involved in designing and delivering entrepreneurship programs in Africa and also teaching at UAL. that the value of intellectual property and understanding the legal framework for creative professionals is absolutely, critical and needs to be part of the curriculum or any training in professional development.
Mhm. Actually, if I may, I'm curious to know something. If I may ask a question of
Sure, you
Dr.
may, yeah.
Badr. Yes. On the issue of intellectual property, what I have found, or protection of intellectual property, what I have found working with creatives in Nigeria, and I will talk in particular about the creatives who are doing really well, who already are making a substantial amount of money from their trade. They simply cannot afford it. It is such an expensive enterprise. I think it probably costs something like $300 to protect a technique in the Nigerian market, just for the Nigerian market. If you move on to global protection, it's more like $3,000. And I'd be curious to know if Dr. Badering can propose to or tell us how African creatives can protect their intellectual property without having to spend such huge amounts, because it's just not possible for them. They just don't have the means. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, the intellectual property faces a lot of problems in Africa generally, particularly in Nigeria. And one of them is what you have highlighted. And there are various ways of going about it. I mean, even developed countries, sometimes they do give some leeway. One way is, for example, for the governments of Africa, including Nigeria, to identify the prospects, the developmental prospects, the contribution that, for example, arts can make to development. These are some of the things we are addressing. And then in that regard, for example, you could give a leeway, the government, if government identifies it, could give a leeway in relation to perhaps, a number of years to ensure that certain work are protected without much emphasis on what they can get from the taxes in that regard, to protect those properties. America did it, in the 1960s, whereby you find that, copyright, when people invent new inventions, you find out that there are incentives for inventors in relation to protecting their intellectual property rights in that regard. And this encouraged people, to be able to invent, go into inventions. Similar to arts, particularly in relation to Africa. If there are incentives in relation to, that's okay. If you create an intellectual property, particularly in relation to art, maybe within a particular period, you could have, opportunity to get this, protected. And also, it's also essential because in intellectual property law, the identifiable properties that are covered by intellectual property. That's another issue whereby the state should be able to perhaps maybe work with artists to identify, particular creations that will enjoy such protection. So it depends a lot on the state appreciating the developmental value, of art. Another problem is perhaps maybe the intellectual property, protection already, if you look at, film production and things like that. But the other issue is perhaps maybe enforcing them through, despite the fact that they are, these enjoy protection. A lot of the time, people violate them and nothing happens. Sometimes artists have to go on the spree by themselves in trying to perhaps engage with people who violate those. So all those are big problems, which perhaps, needs to be looked at.
Thank you, Professor Badrin. There are a couple of questions. We have one from Lucy, and I can't see your question yet because it's in the, you posted it in the chat. I'll pick that up in a moment. But the one I'm looking at is from Peter Badejo. Hello, Peter. And he said he would like the mixed presentation forms. Are you able to see the question? It's a question. He likes the mixed presentation. Artists have forever been trying and struggling to show government, and on and off, just trying to get to the question. It is said earlier today that the key issue is about respect and value. And are there other ways of approaching the issue of making African policymakers get it? So it's how we get these messages across to government. What can we do collectively?
I seem to be speaking an awful lot, but I've just had that experience. When we wanted to do this exhibition in Paris, actually, it was the exhibitors that contacted me saying they wanted Nigeria to come. That was in 2019. And I wrote to every government official that I know, every head of a bank that I know, every head of a hedge fund that I know, to try and see if we could get funding or somebody to lead it. I'm not Nigeria, I'm just Tosi Animesha. I'm a private citizen. I couldn't. And I was very frustrated by this. So it was my mother, my 87-year-old mother, that financed Nigeria's participation in the fair. It cost a fortune, but she did it. But what I did was to call on a minister that I knew, who had been the Nigerian ambassador to UNESCO, and a very good one at that. And I put the project to her and said, I'm not asking you to give me any money. I just want you to come. And she came with people from the Nigerian Export Promotion Council and other, the Bank of Industry. I mean, she came with a delegation of people who were concerned by this sort of activity. And I can tell you that seeing is the best thing that you can do with government officials. The impact is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And I'm actually going to have to go to Abuja to go make a presentation to some ministers on this whole idea of market to market. When governments understand what they can gain financially from these activities, they take an interest. It's what happened with the Nigerian film industry. When I was a child, Nigerian films used to be sold on DVDs in the market. Today, the Nigerian film industry, I think we can all agree, is one of the biggest. It's certainly the second biggest employer in Nigeria, and government is supporting them. I think that after what we did in Paris last week, and when they saw the interest of the world in Nigerian art and in other African art, because Zambia was there, they had a small delegation, but they did have a presence at that fair. And I have a Cameroonian friend who brought in some artists from other African countries. I think when the minister and all her delegations saw the potential, and were also able to work out the potential for the creation of jobs in a continent that receives 12 million young people every year with no jobs for them, I think it had an impact. So that is what that's one way. There might be other ways of getting government interest.
And working together also is important, really, rather than doing it individually. I mean, you mentioned the Nigerian film industry. People coming together, working together, lobbying the politicians. I'm everywhere this is done. I mean, even in the academic circles. I mean, so that's another way which perhaps maybe people need to work together a little bit more to show the value of the work they do.
Absolutely. One of the reasons the French and the Italians are so strong in fashion is because they have apex organizations. They come together and they lobby together. I mean, the lace makers, for example, in Chantilly have a whole association just for them. And when they need something, they go to the government en masse. And one of the things that has come out from the sector analysis we're doing over and over again is the need for this apex organization that will lobby government so that they can put in place the policies that are required, the infrastructures that are required, and so on and so forth. And when they work together, they can actually do more. Now I will stop talking.
Thank you. So Lucy's question for Job is, I'm interested to know what you think about open source knowledge platforms like Wikipedia. And Lucy has had a really interesting knowledge exchange project that she's been working on with Wikipedia and involving students.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy, for that question. I've come across conversations on the issue of Wikipedia, especially in relation to scholarly publishing and knowledge production in the African continent. It is one of the greatest resources that acts as the first point of of information for scholars and researchers in the continent. And unfortunately, there's so many disparities that that Wikipedia exhibits. You'll find that most African individuals are not listed in the Wikipedia, particularly women. I'm also aware that there are initiatives to increase the visibility of women in the continent through various wikidons and so on. And I know people who have participated in them, in trying to highlight the profiles of various individuals, particularly women in the continent. So first, it is a great resource, but there are those disparities that it exhibits, especially in relation to scholarly publishing and knowledge dissemination.
Thank you, Job. And this is the last question because of time, and it's from Lucy Kimball. Do NGOs and SME based in Africa value collaborations with universities in the global north, i.e. via student projects, for example, John's example? John, would you like to respond to that?
Well, in our admittedly limited experience, very much so. What we found with the NGOs that we were working with was that we gave the work to them, and it then enabled them to, one, provide the basis for some evidence-based activism. This is happening, this is exactly how it's happening, this is who's saying what to whom and how deep within the network it goes. So that's maybe providing some assets that would otherwise be quite difficult to reach. The other thing, the response that we got from our partners, was that the diversity of the student body is a real strength. I think about the cohort at undergrad level, students from all over the world, China, India, Philippines, Brazil, Hong Kong, US, and at MA level, even more diverse, I must say. I think that does go some way to mitigating perhaps the potential problem of thinking that, well, this is a Northern Hemisphere white Western university, why should we do anything with them? So we certainly see value from those two perspectives. One huge challenge in this is how to take the work further, and often funding is really, really elusive, not just for NGOs, but also for local activists on whom NGOs depend mostly for the work that they do. And certainly at university level, funding for this kind of work is also very elusive. it doesn't, for example, obviously lead to things like student recruitment or types of measures that the university might have for impact. That then, I think, gives us a real opportunity to say, look, we had this impact. If you're not supporting this, you should be, and that would enable us perhaps to do more and go further and fully develop some of these prototypes so that they could be, some of this work is reaching up into quite a high level at government level in South Sudan and in Cameroon and at UNESCO and UN level. It's just that without the resources to fully develop, it's quite easy to say, well, that looks great, but sorry, we can't afford to do it.
Thank you, John. I'm now, thank you to all our speakers and also the audience for those questions. I'm now going to hand over to my co-chair, Mark. And this is a really exciting part of the afternoon of hearing from our early career researchers, and the future lies with them in terms of the creation of new methodologies and frameworks that we were talking about in the previous session. So I am particularly delighted that we've been able to make this part of the symposium possible.
Oh, well, thanks as well for being invited into the room, and thanks for all the contributions that have happened today. It's been a really good conversation on many, many levels. There's so much to draw out of. I think this just now we've got 3 people, I think, presenting together. Is that correct? And I think we've got Svea Josephy, Duncan Wooldridge, and Ranji Manku. So looking forward to this side, I've always advocated one thing just in my work. It's really important that we focus on the making, and we ask 2 or 3 critical questions, which I just want to put in as a proposition before we go forward. It's what's the work is doing, something to reflect on. So I'm not sure who's going to lead this presentation. I think it's Duncan, if I'm right. Thank you, Duncan. Off you go.
Thank you, Mark. Just by way of introduction, my name is Duncan Wooldridge. I'm the course leader for Fine Art Photography at Camberwell College of Arts. And I'm really happy to introduce the video that's been produced by my colleague Svea Josephy at UCT and by a UCT alum and current UAL student Ranji Manku. And this is going to introduce the Global Photographies Network, but also a project that Ranji has extended by taking part in a collaborative workshop that was established by Global Photographies, which brought together students from Argentina, South Africa, and the UK to work with the Mexican publisher Hydra. Global Photographies is a horizontal platform that was set up in 2020, and it uses online platforms like this to invite speakers, foster academic collaboration, and organize workshops, bringing students together. Please play the recording, thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Svea Josephy from the Michaelis School of Fine Art at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. UCT is part of the Global Photographies Network founded by colleagues Duncan Wooldridge and Lucy Suter from the UAL, along with Sarah Pickering from the Slade. The Global Photographies Network reached out to the photo section of UCT in 2020 in order to collaborate on projects which encourage decolonial thinking, inclusivity, diversity, and transformation, and to encourage deep thinking, dialogue, exchange, engagement, and participation amongst our photography students. In 2021, several of our students took part in a Global Photographies Network photo book program led by myself and Ana Casa Bodas of Hydra, a photographic education and publishing platform in Mexico. UCT students such as Ranji Manku, who will be presenting her project here, entered into critical dialogue with students from the UK, Mexico, Argentina, Iran, Dubai, UK, Rwanda, and South Africa in this rich and exciting program. We are very pleased that Ranji will be presenting her project here today, as she has moved on from UCT and is now doing her MA at UAL.
Morning, everyone. My name is Ranji Manku. I'm a UCT graduate, and I'm currently doing my MA in Fashion Critical Studies at Central St. Martin's. I will be presenting my fourth year project, which I produced at UCT in 2020, and it's titled Iqina. The word Iqina means the knot in my home language of isiXhosa, and this knot is a metaphor for the complex schema that makes up my identity, where my individual experience is woven up in my family and the collective identities that they subscribe to. Those of being Xhosa traditionalists and Salvation Army Christians on my mother's side, and being academics, educators, and Anglican Christians on my father's side. And all of this happening in the landscape of Ginsberg Township throughout the 20th century into the 21st century, and intersecting with the philosophy of Black consciousness. All in all, Iqina is a project about how my two families constructed and practiced and archived identity in the face of colonial violence and erasure. And it's sort of presenting solutions as to how I might do the same. At the center of this project is an idea presented by my father in the biography that he wrote of Bantu Stephen Biko, who was a South African writer, philosopher, and prominent anti-apartheid activist. Biko was a native of Ginsberg Township and founded the philosophy known as Black consciousness, which was based on ideas of Black power, Black self-reliance, and presented ideas of Black beauty, etc. The idea of invisible lineages refers to the hidden histories that make up our frame of thinking. It's the things that were taught directly and subliminally through our family and cultural histories. In reading Biko's biography, I felt like I was for the first time in conversation with my dad about his family history and was able to more deeply contextualize him, my mother, their parents, and their siblings alongside Black consciousness ideology in Ginsberg towards the end of apartheid and the perspectives and thought processes that informed how my sisters and I were raised. Both of my parents grew up in a township called Ginsberg in King Williamstown in the Eastern Cape. And fundamentally, Ginsberg is the closest thing that I know to be my parents' ancestral home. However, when you think about it in terms of the origins of townships as a construct of apartheid geopolitics, it becomes a point where ideas of home and lineage meet the broader narrative of apartheid. But in the end, it's where my family history is situated and where my grandparents built their lives and built their identities. I grew up in Sandton, Johannesburg, and throughout my education and upbringing, I was in predominantly white spaces where assimilation was treated as currency for acceptance, and white supremacist colonialist missionary thinking was upheld by racist peers and teachers and anti-Black hair policies and more. At its core, Iqina is my artistic response to cultural amnesia and the dilemma of needing to locate myself within a broader history or master narrative in the present, and seeking a way of recognizing and identifying myself that isn't tied to whiteness and Eurocentric constructions of history. The knowledge of my grandfather's archive changed my whole project, adding a different dimension to the project that I'd been working on for half of 2020. As my mom, aunts, and uncles narrated the stories that they had attached to each photograph, an additional layer of context was added to the photographic archive that I had at home. Through my grandfather's photography, I began to truly unpack my family's membership in the Salvation Army, discovering that it had dated all the way back to the 1910s. I took particular interest in the uniform and how this colonial export of missionary Christianity had been hybridized and was now being articulated in isiXhosa language, thus becoming part of my Xhosa history. I also visited my paternal aunt, who now lives in my grandmother's old house, and she let me look through my grandmother's photographic archives, which largely had photos of graduations and those weekends where my grandmother would have the children of Ginsberg gather in her house and use singing as a medium for teaching and community building. Engagement with my grandfather's archive made clear all of these intersections between my two families that invited the questions that I'm now asking in my MA around the function of identity performance in Black communities and how fashion, performance, and photography intersect in the construction and narration of identity. My families are two of millions of families that had to make life under apartheid and develop modes of self-representation that could sustain them within their community. And by that, I mean grant them social safety while functioning as a vehicle for self-assertion in the face of state-sanctioned violence. This makes the concerns of Iqina continuously poignant. As a Gen Z Black Xhosa woman, I often grapple with this idea of having to look to the past in order to understand my identity, perspective, and tone of voice in the present, and imagine what it might look and sound like in the future. As a storyteller, it feels like my job is to unpack and narrate these things in a way that's translatable in the present. Thank you.
Okay. Duncan, I'm just asking, is that presentation through?
So that's our presentation, and we look forward to taking part in the conversation. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay. I think we can move then. That was really, there's an awful lot there. It's fantastic. I've loved the kind of intersectional conversations across continent and across time and across identities. And I particularly enjoyed, Steve Biko, I think, is someone who's been forgotten, and the importance of his work is really, so it's fantastic to see such a young scholar dealing with and integrating that political kind of intersection of that very important moment in time. And it also just echoes the issues around state violence and hidden histories and lineages. So that's a really exciting way of seeing what I said earlier, the work is doing. So that's really strong. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on that. We're going to move now to Yvonne Ninshoma. If she would like to go forward now, that'd be great. If they'd like to go forward, that'd be brilliant. Is Yvonne with us? Yes.
I am. Afternoon all.
Afternoon.
Shall I share my screen or the presentation? Great, thank you. So this afternoon I'd like to talk about contextualized fashion design curriculum and pedagogy in Ghana and its contribution to decolonization. This has been my research, my baby for many years, and I hope we can contribute or draw some conclusions that will help us in terms of contextualizing and decolonizing our curriculum. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to start this afternoon's provocational thoughts with an African proverb that I really identify with. And it's, I think, therefore I am, is at odds with the African saying and not attributed to any one person. So Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. How do we make curriculum and pedagogy inclusive and collaborative in terms of our student population today? If we think of our student population today in the UK and globally, fashion education has been exported all over the world, but is the curriculum and pedagogy relevant to the student body today? My journey started off at Bradford University and Design Institute Africa in Ghana. And this is where I saw the gap in the curriculum. This is where I saw that the pedagogy and the curriculum that I've been used to in England was not always favorable to international students, not always favorable out of context of the West. So with this, I decided to go on the journey of my research and find ways to bridge the gap, ways in conveying the brief and the questions asked of students and how they can best optimize the educations that they've embarked on. So, like I said, the aperture in the curriculum appears throughout the curriculum, and quite often in creative education, we speak of freedom and allowing our students to have the freedom to express themselves, develop as individuals. but our curriculum quite often inhibits them from doing that very thing. So fashion design program in West Africa, as I've expressed, had a great aperture. For instance, I was lecturing in history of fashion, where I found a lot of the curriculum or pedagogy that was based on the history of fashion was based on the history of fashion of Western world. And I had to do a lot of research and a lot of consolidating in order for the students to have an understanding, to be able to put in place some sort of timeline in how history happened for their context and how history happened, fashion history happened in the West. So just a quick overview of the history of fashion and fashion education in Ghana. I mean, that the indigenous fashion education or formal fashion education stems from apprenticeship, and it's now led to what we know now as vocational educational system. But this stemmed from a system of passing on knowledge and technical hands-on knowledge that was taught from generation to generation, which has fed into our technical colleges within Ghana now. This piece of work is by a student called Alexander Tumiyama, and Alex comes from 2 different cultures. And again, how do we make curriculum and pedagogy contextual for a student like this who's from Japan and from Ghana? Alex went through a period of self-investigation, if you like. Her education was used as a way to find out who she really is, where she stands in the world, and how she can combine her education to develop her style as a creative and herself as a person. So fashion pedagogy within the Ghanaian context, and how can this be exported, and how can this embrace home students and international students? The grading gap that's been found in Western education for international students is quite relevant. And it is something that we as educators have to address and always be thoughtful of. So the Business of Fashion in September 2017 established that the average cost of fashion education starts from 18,000 to 23,000 upwards. I mean, I think now it's a lot more. So if students are investing this sort of money into their education, and we have a growing number of fashion institutes, not only going abroad to establish other departments in other countries, but growing their international student bodies at home, with more than 30 colleges within England. How do we address this grading gap, and how do we make our curriculum and pedagogy contextual for not only our international students, but when we export these curriculums and fashion degree programs, how do we make it relevant for the context in which they're in? Another example is a student called Papopong and another student, Stephen French, who have both another self-exploration developed into artists of their own, designers of their own, and have brilliantly managed to fuse the Western style of fashion with their context in which they're from. These 2 are 2 that initially were very confused about the briefs they were given and how they can find themselves within the briefs that they were given. But again, as I was saying earlier, as educators, it is our problem or our puzzle to solve, to make sure that our students can optimize within the pedagogy that we give to them. Students are on a journey when they enter our degree courses, a journey of self and self-discovery, as well as their styles, as I said earlier. As educators, it is our puzzle, our problem to solve, and to find ways in each individual optimizing on their abilities, their styles, and develop as creative beings. As I pointed out earlier on, the aperture is growing as the degree courses grow and as we expand into other countries with the creative curriculum. We do need to address how the curriculum is established and how it's developed in order to fulfill its brief, in order for all students to be capable of gaining a first or a 2-1 in their degree programs, if that's what they should so wish. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Yvonne. That's really, really insightful. I'm really mindful of time because I know that Rudy is literally packing bags and running to airport. So I'm going to go straight to Rudy if we can, please. Thank you, Rudy, for being so patient.
Hiya, thanks for having me today. Lynn, are you able to share the presentation?
Yes, I will, Rudy.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I can just say I'm a first-year PhD student at Chelsea, and I have a painting and drawing practice.
Thank you, Rudy.
I'm Rudy Lowe. The focus of my being during 1967 to 1976. I'm Rudy Lowe. The focus of my practice-based PhD research is Britain's response to Black Power in the English-speaking Caribbean during 1967 to 1976. I'm using recently declassified records from the Information Research Department, the IRD, as source material for painting and drawing. Records from the IRD, Britain's secret propaganda unit, were transferred to the National Archives in 2019. For almost 3 decades, the IRD operated within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, reinforcing anti-communist ideas. As Black Power ideology gained traction in the late 1960s, the remit of the IRD expanded to include this new perceived threat. Michelle Rolfe-Truleau reasons that any single event enters history with some of its constituting parts missing. Something is always left out while something else is recorded. Although the IRD files are technically declassified, it's impossible to research them in their entirety because they are redacted and, in some cases, closed for public access. This year, I made a Freedom of Information request to view an IRD file from 1970. The document is retained by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO. The request was denied as they deemed it as a threat to national security. Achille Mbembe remarks, the debris in the archive is buried until a death occurs in order to stop the dead from stirring up disorder in the present. What does it mean when the debris refuses to die? If after 52 years this record could still be considered a threat to national security, one must wonder what it contains. I speculate that it could be because of Britain's current relationship to the Caribbean that this file now remains closed, when documents from other regions that are so damning in their content have become declassified. A continuing question in this study is if the presence of contemporary Black resistance movements in the UK, such as Black Lives Matter, have affected the justification for specific IRD files not being released. The likelihood that these IRD files could stir up disorder in the present among UK-based Caribbean communities is high. A recent report commissioned by the Home Office outlines that 30 years of racist immigration legislation designed to reduce the UK's non-white population led to the Windrush scandal. Amelia Gentleman writes that government officials repeatedly tried to suppress the report over the past year. Heightened tensions between the British government and UK-based Caribbean communities must be considered when examining why some of these IRD records have not been released for public access. Giles Scott Smith states that it was imperative that IRD propaganda be created unattributably for the sake of deniability, but also because the British government did not want it to be known that they were issuing material attacking governments with which it is friendly. Merriam-Webster defines unattributable as not able to be ascribed or credited to a source. It highlights the British government's intentions to conceal without responsibility, to impersonate, to play. This research embodies a Black trans approach when examining history and archival records. There are several people referred to in the archives by their birth names. However, in this study, they will only be referred to by their chosen names. Where possible, unattributable propaganda would tarnish multiple targets. In 1964, at the request of Conservative Prime Minister Alec Douglas Home, Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah became the subject of IRD propaganda as he was said to be tilting towards Moscow. By 1970, targeting Nkrumah alongside the Black Power activist Kwame Ture was also a means of sowing anti-Black Power sentiment transcontinentally. IRD official John Rayner writes that the intention was to encourage differences between United States and Caribbean Black Power advocates and Africans. Initially, the IRD aimed to distribute the propaganda in Africa, attacking US and Caribbean Black Power activists, but they concluded that this could be best done by focusing on Ture and Nkrumah. Posing as a fictional West African group, the Black Power Africa's Heritage Group, the IRD wrote an article, "Enough is Enough, Why Kwame Ture Must Go and Do His Thing Elsewhere." This was then sent out to English-speaking African countries and selected individuals, newspapers, and suitable organizations in the Caribbean and the US. The IRD also launched a propaganda campaign against the Bermudian Black Power group, the Blackberry Cadre. One unattributable piece critiques the Blackberry Cadre as spouting a Black Power ideology supplied by their big brothers in the US, a foreign importation and one which Bermuda cannot afford. The IRD regularly published unattributable propaganda via the Swiss Press Review, exploiting the idea of Swiss neutrality. Publishing articles unattributably through the Swiss Press Review meant that Caribbean media outlets were often unknowingly republishing articles written by British officials. So far in my visual work, I've been responding to the archival material through different approaches. In my painting and drawing, I'm considering how redaction or concealment can be used as an artistic method to point to power relations. With the surveillance of Black Power activists by British officials, Blackness becomes hypervisible in the archive. Black people are denied anonymity or privacy unless they are working with the British government. To be rendered invisible in the archive is to remove culpability. The starting point for the Old Devonshire Church Fire Bermuda painting series was an IRD file that includes reports about the Blackberry Cadre and mentions an arson attack that destroyed the church. British officials viewed the Blackberry Cadre as a serious threat to security in Bermuda and were keen to pin any possible charges on them. In a telegram, British official A.J. Fairclough suggests, as measures against Black resistance in Bermuda, removal of especially obnoxious leaders from circulation by deporting and stop-listing non-Bermudians, and special efforts to secure convictions leading to significant terms of imprisonment of offending Bermudians. In the Old Devonshire Church series, I was interested in what Rinaldo Walcott describes as glimpses of Black freedom. This is the autonomy to decide what does and does not belong in a decolonial landscape, bringing into question who built the church in the first place. There is something I want to reconcile between how the Blackberry Cadre are described by British officials as dangerous and the reality of Bermuda's violent colonial history. In this series, I explore the idea of fire as a means of anti-colonial resistance, referencing the history of Black people during the slave trade setting fire to plantations, highlighting that sometimes fire is one of the only tools of resistance available in the face of colonial power. Thank you.
Just unmuting myself. Thank you, Rudy. That's really interesting research. Love the idea of the kind of influence of the Cold War running through all this as well, which is really important work, which I'm particularly interested in. Love to catch up with you at some point about the research further. We're going to move, because of time, straight to Igor Awai Sowinski. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm delighted to be with you today as part of the first UAL Africa Symposium. My research contextualizes Jamaican sculptor and philosopher Ronald Clive Moody as an international network figure and artistic practitioner through the examination of his artworks, exhibition history, and personal papers held at the Tate Archive. My research examines Moody through four key moments or conjunctures in his life. These moments aim to frame and position Moody as one of the most significant modernist sculptors of the 20th century, with a staying power that continues to have ongoing impact and influence. Through his role in the Harlem Renaissance, the Caribbean Artist Movement, the Second World Black and African Festival of Art and Culture, FESTAC, and the Black British Art Movement, we are able to move beyond the dominant accepted narrative that grounds Moody as forgotten, invisible, or marginalized. Today's contribution focuses on the 1977 moment, FESTAC. FESTAC 77 saw more than 17,000 artists from 57 countries ascend on Lagos, Nigeria, and over 500,000 spectators attended the non-stop activities and special events. The event welcomed the likes of Audre Lorde, Stevie Wonder, Miriam Makeba, Osabisa to its National Theatre. The aims of the festival was revival, resurgence, propagation and promotion of Black and African culture and Black cultural values and civilization, and to facilitate a periodic return to origin by Black artists, writers and performers uprooted to other continents. Initially, Nigeria's head of state, Yakubu Gowon, served as FESTAC's co-patron with Senegalese President Leopold Senghor, who had hosted the first World Festival of Negro Arts in 1966, under the direction of Ellen Diop in Dakar. The governing body for FESTAC was the International Festival Committee, which represented 16 festival zones in which the Black African world had been divided. Ronald Moody's subject file TGA 956/2/8, which is also available to be explored online, spans the period 1974 to 1977 and gives us a unique insight as it charts the aims of the festival, its difficulties faced in regards to coordinating and overseeing contribution from selection, fundraising, delays, publicity, and publications. In 1974, Moody was invited to serve on the festival's artistic program subcommittee as chair. The subcommittee was comprised of Moody, Nigerian artist Uzo Ogunu, who worked closely alongside Moody in facilitating the UK delegation as the deputy chair of the subcommittee, British photographer Mill Penlock, Emmanuel Jegede, the Right Honourable Ron Phillips, and renowned actor Earl Cameron. Moody and Ogunu were friends and collaborators who met in London in the 1960s. They exhibited together. Ogunu, a member of the Commonwealth generation who achieved success in Britain in the 1950s and 60s. Within Moody's papers, there's a 1965 press clipping on Ogunu written by Moody. It discusses his painting, education, and background. The piece is accompanied by the image seen here. Moody and Ogunu collaborated on the 1972 Africa Writers Series publication, Amadou's Bundles, Fulani Tales of Love and Gins, by Malum Amadou. The book is a collection originally from northern Cameroon and Nigeria of the Fulani, songs, fables, tales collected by Gulakel through dictation and then translated into English by Moody. Uzo Ogunu provides the cover illustration, which you see here. FESTAC entries for the UK zone encompass theatre, a cohort of musicians that included Osabisa, a screening of Pressure by Horace Ove, literature, poetry, colloquium, which included Black Cultural Archives co-founder Len Garrison, and Althea Leconte Jones, a British Black Panther, who came to attention in 1970 as one of the 9 protesters known as the Mangrove 9. Artists representing the UK included Aubrey Williams, Winston Branch, Uzo Ogunnu, Sue Smock, and Donald Locke. Len Garrison's papers held at the Black Cultural Archives includes a Festac subject file, which contains photographs, ephemeras, and copies of colloquiums given over the duration of the festival. It also includes a copy of Wally Inca's paper titled The Scholar in African Society. In the official catalogue, Leopold Senghor states, the success of Festac should consider its colloquium as the most important point which should define, defend, and illustrate Black civilization and above all, spirit. Moody's artworks, Yohanan, 1936, is Moody's most reproduced and exhibited work. Made of elm, it stands over 1.5 meters high. It was part of the touring exhibition curated by Rashid Arine's The Other Story in 1989. And in 1992, it became part of Tate's permanent collection. In 2021, David A. Bailey curated exhibition Between Two Islands. Yohanan, alongside Moody's onlooker, greeted and welcomed you into the extensive survey exhibition that spanned over 70 years of visionary paintings, documentary photography, fashion, film, and sculpture. Moody's onlooker artwork connects us to a timeline and lineage of Black artistic thought post-Second World War. It was exhibited at the Présence Africaine Rome Conference in 1959, where Moody also contributed a colloquium titled The Responsibility of the Artist. It was also exhibited in the First World Festival of Liberal Arts, Dakar, 1966, and Festac. In 2016, it became part of Tate's permanent collection. Yohanan and the onlooker artworks position Moody firmly within the evolving discourse that continues to define what art, Black art could be, can be, and is. Pictured here is the collaborative 2019 publication between the UAL Research Centre, After All, and the Chimurenga Library Series, which gathered extensive archival materials, interviews, and new commissions. A remix that brings the festival to a new generation and audience, whilst using the archives of those who were present and involved. Ronald Moody's subject file relating to Festac offers us an activation point to interrogate and engage this conjuncture within the context of post-colonial Nigeria, aesthetic discourses of the Black Atlantic, geopolitics, historical, and the Black arts movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Iko. Thank you very much. Really love the idea of the evolving discourse around Black art practice. Couldn't be more poignant. And what's nice as well, what's really interesting is that a lot of this history is not dead, it's living. And people are still around. And I think one of the most important things around thinking about this time is that it seems to be temporally pushed back, or actually, if we can get to the source, which is often still with us, we can really clarify some of these important political kind of conjunctures about the thinking and making of Black art practice, rather than dangerously homogenizing perspectives on the time and place of the making of the work. I think we've got I think we are overrunning, if I'm correct. So I think we've got we've got an opportunity for a few questions. I'm just looking in the Q&A. Where are we? Hi, Mark, just a couple of questions. This is from Sophie Punt. A couple of questions that have come in. Is there any suggestion to the issue of negation of students' work in their authority is of a person from African continent? Okay, I'm not quite sure how to answer that, or who will judge that. Any comments on there? A negation of student authority on a person from the African continent? And where can I access literature of fashion and textiles scholarship from African scholars, please? Should we do Yvonne, should we try and do something around accessing literature? Is that okay if I give that to you? think you might be muted.
Yes, yes. Like I mentioned earlier, Essel is a really good author. He's based in Ghana. He's a researcher, constantly putting papers out. I'll put his name in the chat box.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, especially to Ranji. Ranji, it's a deeply political exercise with a capital P that you're involved in, and I do love the intersection between the family archive and the official archives and the state archives. Can I just ask you a question about? I think someone's got the mic. Can I just ask you about the manifest, how that will be made manifest as a project? Will it be exhibition, publication, for example? How are you going to put that into the world?
So the project was an exhibition. It was my 4th year exhibition in 2020, and it was in the form of a photo book and the portrait series.
Okay, I'm struggling to hear a little bit, but I gather it was an exhibition that you originally pushed it out. Yes.
Yeah, I'll just fill in because Ranji's got an audience there. It was a photo book primarily, and that's what she worked on with Anna in the global photographies thing as well. It was a beautiful photo book.
Okay, it adds the kind of questions around distribution as well, doesn't it? How do we make sure that we get to see and share this work that's been done? I think that's a kind of unifying question, isn't it? How I think one of the things, I mean, the ideas of networks and sharing and making sure that things are made available either online or directly is really important. I think especially around publishing and knowledge and authors. I think that we keep on, just a critical question for ourselves, we keep on kind of resetting the work that needs to be done when there's a massive amount of work that's already been done. And we tend to start from zero every 10 years, for example, around a critical point. And it means that we're always catching up rather than having or understanding or collating a deep pool of knowledge, which is clearly there, but it often exists in isolation and through specialist kind of research works, for example. So I think there is a case to be there is a case for expanding where the bones are, where the knowledge lives, and not also just about teaching it, but also about making it accessible just through channels of inquiry. I think that's a very important point. So I think I don't think there's any burning questions in the Q&A, and I'm mindful of time. And I think my job now is to hand back over to Maureen, I do believe, for a more generic summing up with Professor David Umba.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to all our speakers. And that was such a rich and insightful session. And it's a fantastic way of ended what has been, an amazing day of discourse. And we are actually ending with the future, because all our young, researchers today, these are stories that, you will one day hopefully continue to tell, and the situation will be a very different one for you as you progress through your careers. Has David arrived? We still waiting for David?
David's here.
Hello, David.
Hello.
Hello, welcome back. Well, we've had a fantastic time, and wish we had longer, as you can imagine. I have got, you've seen some of the feedback from session 1 and 2, and I've narrowed it down to like 5 points, but I will let you go first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I just pull my document. Oh, what's happened to my screen? Can you still see me? I don't know if you can see me.
Yes.
Okay, I can't see myself now. That's always the worry. You're not quite sure. Well, firstly, I just want to say how fabulous and fantastic all the discussions have been. I mean, we began early on looking at the ambitions of the African Union. We spoke about Agenda
2063 and the appetite to expand and to develop higher education within the continent, in particular sub-Saharan Africa. And within that context, there was discussions around the various committees across the continent who are working in this space. We also heard about different types of collaborations going on within many regions within the continent. We also touched on Aura and their centers of excellence and how they're reaching out to bring expertise together so that they have more meaningful impact within the continent. We spoke about the World Bank and all the support that that's providing, but we also acknowledged during discussions that a lot of the focus has been really away from the arts and culture, and we quickly began to funnel back into arts and culture, and how we can raise awareness within the continent. And I think in the second session there was discussions around how traditionally the arts have not been recognized in Africa, and there should be a bit more of a focus on the creative economy and the need to value this. I think there was a suggestion about how can we integrate creative contributions into national GDP calculations. A fantastic idea. That in alone is a huge project, and one perhaps we should think about collectively. I think we also acknowledge the role that digitization can play in embracing and supporting collaborations, and I mean collaborations in the true sense of collaboration, but also acknowledged, one of our speakers acknowledged the threats that exchanging data can bring and can pose. Who owns the data? Which raises questions about data governance and so forth, and so on and so forth. I think one of our speakers also touched on the existing perspective of north to south, and how do we begin to change that narrative to maybe south to north, or maybe south to south. Really, how do we tell our own story to gain the recognition of the fantastic work and scholarship that's going on within the continent. And last session, I dropped into the presentation on decolonization and the fantastic work, as you've alluded to, Maureen, of our young researchers around the fantastic work of African scholars and practitioners that's ongoing. So, there's so much more I can say. I don't think I can give it enough justice in the time I have. But what I would like to do is to say a massive thank you to not just all our speakers, but also the chairs, and to everybody who's taken the time to join this event and to speak and to listen and to contribute to your questions. Huge thank you to you, Maureen, and also to Sophia Proka and Paul Godwin, as part of our African regional team, who've pulled all this together, a huge amount of work, with Lynn Finn in the background supporting and helping manage all the digital issues we've had with presentations. But fantastic work. For me, from the University of the Arts, London, it's what next? And I think we need more time to unpick some of our discussions so far. I think we need to think about calling or putting together another event to begin to unpick some of these opportunities. There are many, many areas I can see for future collaboration. But I think very early on, if I can recall, I think it was James who talked about what are the principles on which we're going to be collaborating. I think we need to discuss a bit more about that. As the largest arts and design institution in Europe, we are really keen to work more with our colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa actually in the continent, but to find ways that we establish the partnership and the principles of that partnership that ensures that it's not the North-South, but it's more inclusive, more collaborative, and of the benefits to all who participate in that regard. So I think from me, Maureen, it's a huge thank you to everybody who's been involved in this. Again, thank you to you and the team for pulling this together, very timely. but I challenge you to think about the next and how we progress from this point, so that we can build on this. I know this is the first of many, but there's so much in here that needs so much time, and to just think about how we then move on to the next stage. So that's my challenge to the African Regional Group in terms of what we do next. I'll clearly be as supportive as I can in my role within the university. So that's a thank you from me. I'll pass it back to you, Maureen.
Thank you, David. Hopefully my camera, can you all see me?
I can.
Great, so because I can't see myself. So I won't go over what you've already meticulously, summed up to already, Dave, but what I do want to take away is the need for, respect, inclusion for indigenous culture, knowledge and philosophies of the African continent, how we reclaim our epistemological sovereignty and create new epistemologies, and to be able to tell our own stories. And I think hearing from our African scholars today, and I'd like to say now colleagues and friends, that we hope we are now, today has, it's a new continuation of the journey, but a different way. And we will be looking to your leadership as we move forward. And then the other for me is around how important it is for us to invest in young people. And that came clearly from the Africa Center, where you heard I'd spent my knowledge exchange secondment last autumn, and it was absolutely wonderful. But it'd be more fantastic to see the relaunch of the center last year. And I'm personally looking forward to when the center is able to open its education research center, which we hopefully will be in a couple of years' time. And we can share that with UK as well as our scholars in Africa. And because the PhD candidates and the MA students that we heard from today, there is a need to continue for us to have perhaps even a monthly platform of sharing those research and practices. And I think that's something that's very simple that we could, work together to make happen. And obviously, it goes without saying, is the sustainable collaboration, open, ethical, long-term, respectful, and mutually beneficial. And I won't say any more except to say a huge thank you. And there is a slide which I hope you can all see, with all the acknowledgements that I won't go through all the names again, but I do want to say a huge thank you to the production team, and somebody whose name is not mentioned today is Edwige, who is the graphic designer and the branding for the symposium, and she's actually just graduated from our MA, one of our MA design courses at UAL, London College of Communication. So we're really grateful to have had the visualization of the symposium there. And thanks Lynn again and the production team for today, and anybody else who I have forgotten to mention. And thank you, David. This thing I do want to share with you, and it was interesting that today we heard one of our speakers mention the heart, Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness. And Peter Bodeja, Peter, you still with us? I know that we speakers, the audience, you're not able to speak, but if that was possible to hear from Peter. because a week in next week, the 22nd, on Windrush Day, we have an amazing storytelling workshop and panel discussion with live music, and which will be led by Peter Badejo and myself and other artists. And Peter did a production 22 years ago, and which is an inversion of The Heart of Darkness, which is called The Heart of Dance, and The Heart of Life, which is about new humanities. And so it's really quite interesting when we talk about how we reclaim sovereignty and our own, you know, African philosophies and cultures, that this is fundamentally what Emijo is, and to actually hear it being articulated several times throughout the course of today is a real kind of testament to artists, Peter, who have brought this to the table 22 years ago and have now come back into UAL with us to celebrate Windrush Day on the 22nd of June. And I will put the link in the chat so you can have that information. Thank you. Peter, you there?
Hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I wish we can just continue for another 12 hours and then we do the Emijo. A lot of things came out of this. It's very, very enlightening for me. And the last statement that was made, how do we tell our own stories? We're all storytellers. And it's amazing, the stories that have come out today. In fact, the one that rounded it up for me was the loss we have now about the two largest, greatest festivals that has happened to Black nation, the one in 66 and the one in 77 in Nigeria. But that notwithstanding, Emijo is looking at the past, the present, and where we go in the future. And we can only do that if we understand where we are coming from to know where we're going. So I hope next week we'll be able to discuss fully what Emijo is all about. Emijo is the story, is our story, how we tell it, who we tell it to, and who tells the story. Thank you very much. Hello?
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.